There's a 10 o'clock window, not a suggestion, not some wellness platitude somebody printed on a mug. A specific 1-hour band on the clock that a mountain of cardiovascular data now ties to measurably different health outcomes in people over 70. Fall asleep earlier than that window, and your risk climbs. Fall asleep later, and it climbs again, from the other direction. The people who happened to close their eyes somewhere between 10 and 11 at night showed the lowest incidence of heart disease in a dataset of 88,000 adults. Not because of what they ate that day, not because of how far they'd walked, because of the hour on the clock when their brains switched off. Sit with that for a second, because it's genuinely strange. We're conditioned to think sleep is about duration. 7 hours, 8 hours, whatever number gets quoted at us. But this research isn't really about how long you sleep. It's about when. And to understand why the hour seems to matter just as much as the duration, you have to go inside the skull, down to a cluster of neurons smaller than a grain of rice, and watch what happens to it as it ages. That cluster sits just above the point where your optic nerves cross, tucked into the hypothalamus. It's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the SCN, and it's made up of roughly 20,000 neurons that function, essentially, as the body's master clock. Every organ runs its own local rhythm, sure, but the SCN is what keeps all of them synchronized to each other and to the 24-hour spin of the planet. It does this mostly through one hormone, melatonin, released by the pineal gland on a schedule the SCN sets, rising in the evening to tell the rest of the body that biological night has arrived. In a young adult, that melatonin rise usually kicks off around 9 or 10 at night and peaks somewhere in the small hours of the morning. But here's the thing, the SCN itself doesn't stay fixed. It changes with age. Charles Czeisler's lab at Harvard Medical School has spent decades documenting exactly this shift, and the finding holds up again and again. As the SCN's neurons lose synchrony with one another, and as the retina's light input to the SCN weakens with age, the entire melatonin curve moves earlier. Older adults aren't simply sleeping differently by choice. Their internal clock is, on average, running on an earlier schedule than the one they grew up with. Doctors call this advanced sleep phase, and by the 7th and 8th decades of life, it's close to universal. Not a disorder, just a predictable recalibration of the master clock itself. That's the first mechanism, and it goes a long way toward explaining why a bedtime that felt completely natural at 45 can start to feel wrong at 75. But on its own, it doesn't explain why 10 to 11 specifically is the window tied to lower cardiovascular risk. For that, you need a second mechanism, one that has nothing to do with the brain's internal clock and everything to do with the heart's relationship to the autonomic nervous system. Blood pressure isn't flat across 24 hours, not even close. In a healthy circadian rhythm, it drops by roughly 10 to 20% during sleep, a pattern researchers refer to as nocturnal dipping. That dip is driven by a shift in the balance between the sympathetic nervous system. Think of it as the accelerator, and the parasympathetic nervous system, the brake. During normal sleep onset, at a time that lines up with the body's internal clock, parasympathetic tone rises, sympathetic tone falls, the heart rate slows, and vascular resistance eases off. None of that is incidental. The cardiovascular system genuinely seems built to expect this offloading on a schedule, not just eventually, but at a particular circadian phase. And this is the layer the 2021 study out of the University of Exeter was actually measuring, even if the researchers weren't naming the mechanism outright. David Plans and his colleagues pulled sleep onset data from 88,026 participants in the UK Biobank, tracked by wrist accelerometer for a week and followed for cardiovascular events over roughly 5 years. Published in European Heart Journal Digital Health, the study found that people who fell asleep between 10 and 11 p.m. had the lowest incidence of cardiovascular disease. People who fell asleep before 10 carried a 24% higher risk. People who fell asleep after midnight carried a 25% higher risk. That relationship wasn't linear, and it wasn't about total sleep duration. The researchers controlled for that. It was specifically about the clock hour of sleep onset, measured against a population-level circadian reference point. Here's where the two mechanisms start talking to each other. If the SCN is what dictates when the cardiovascular system expects that nightly parasympathetic handoff, And if falling asleep significantly earlier or later than that expected phase forces the body into attempting the handoff at the wrong moment, then a mistimed bedtime isn't just a scheduling inconvenience. It's a repeated nightly mismatch between when the heart's rhythm is ready to downshift and when the person is actually asleep. Falling asleep after midnight likely means the sympathetic nervous system stays engaged deep into what should be a low-demand stretch of the night, pushing heart rate and blood pressure up right when the vasculature is expecting rest. Falling asleep unusually early, before the SCN has finished its own transition, may cause a similarly mistimed handoff, just from the opposite direction. Sleep arriving before the physiological gatekeepers are actually ready to release the brake. Now bring in a third layer, because the SCN isn't operating alone in all this. There's a completely separate system, independent of the master clock, called sleep pressure, what sleep researchers, following the two-process model Alexander Borbély first formalized back in 1982, call process S. Sleep pressure builds the longer you're awake, driven largely by adenosine accumulating in the brain, and it dissipates while you sleep. Normally, process S and the SCN circadian signal, process C, interact so you feel sleepy at a moment when both agree. Pressure's high enough and the clock says it's night. In older adults, several things shift at once. Slow-wave sleep, the deep stage where adenosine actually clears, declines measurably starting in midlife, so sleep pressure builds and dissipates differently across the night. Meanwhile, process C has already moved earlier, as we just covered. Put those together, and you get a narrower window where the two systems are genuinely in agreement. And it's outside that window, the body's essentially being asked to sleep, or to stay awake, against its own internal signaling. That's also why simply forcing yourself into an earlier bedtime isn't some universal fix. It's part of why sleep physicians studying older adults, including work summarized by researchers like Sonia Ancoli-Israel at the University of California, San Diego, tend to caution against one-size-fits-all prescriptions. The 10 to 11 window in the Exeter data is a population average. Your own optimal window depends on your own circadian phase, which can be estimated, but which shifts a little differently from person to person, shaped by genetics, morning light exposure, even meal timing. Light especially, because morning sunlight hitting the retina is the single strongest signal the SCN uses to keep the whole system properly aligned in the first place. There's a fourth thread worth pulling here, because it explains why the consequences of this mistiming aren't spread evenly across the night, and why cardiologists pay such close attention to the early morning hours in older patients. Specifically, cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, runs on its own circadian schedule too, and in a well-aligned system, it sits at its lowest point in the late evening, then begins climbing in the few hours before natural waking. A rise chronobiologists call the cortisol awakening response. That's not incidental either. It's part of what preps the cardiovascular system to transition out of its low-demand overnight state and back into daytime activity, nudging blood pressure and heart rate upward in anticipation of getting up. When bedtime is badly mistimed relative to the SCN's own schedule, that cortisol rise can land at the wrong point relative to actual sleep, hitting while a person's still deep asleep instead of near natural waking, or arriving very late relative to a sleep period that only started at midnight or after. Epidemiologists have noted for a long time that cardiovascular events, heart attacks, strokes cluster disproportionately in the early morning hours. One contributing hypothesis, traced back through cardiology literature to work by James Muller at Massachusetts General Hospital in the 1980s, is exactly this: a surge of sympathetic activity and blood pressure arriving on a schedule that, in someone whose circadian rhythm is misaligned, no longer matches when the body is actually transitioning out of sleep. There's a human story tucked under all these statistics, and it has to do with how this finding actually got made. The UK Biobank, the dataset behind the Exeter study, wasn't built to study bedtimes at all. It's one of the largest biomedical databases on Earth, roughly 500,000 volunteers recruited across the United Kingdom starting in 2006, most asked at some point to wear a wrist accelerometer for 7 straight days. That accelerometer data just sat there, essentially, waiting for someone to ask it the right question. David Plans, at the time working between the University of Exeter and the wearable tech company Huma, was one of the researchers who realized those accelerometer traces could be used to algorithmically detect actual sleep onset time, not what people reported the next morning in a survey, which is notoriously unreliable, but the real clock time pulled directly from movement and light data. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. Self-reported bedtime studies have produced inconsistent results for years, partly because people misremember or round their own sleep times without even meaning to. The accelerometer-based approach used in the 2021 study was one of the first large-scale efforts to sidestep that problem entirely, which is a big part of why the 10 to 11 p.m. finding carried more weight than the survey-based work that came before it. And the evidence calibration matters here because these are three separate strands of research, not one unified experiment stitched together. The Exeter cardiovascular data is observational. It shows a strong statistical association across a genuinely massive sample, but on its own it can't prove that shifting your bedtime by an hour changes your cardiovascular risk. Only that the two are correlated, even after adjusting for age, sleep duration, diabetes, and a handful of other factors. The SCN aging research sits on much firmer mechanistic ground, replicated across decades of chronobiology at this point. The nocturnal dipping physiology is well established in cardiology, but the precise chain connecting a mistimed bedtime to a blunted dip has actually been demonstrated more directly in shift workers and jet lag studies than in this specific population of adults over 70. The full causal story, clock misalignment, causing blunted dipping, causing elevated cardiovascular risk in older sleepers specifically, is biologically coherent, and every individual piece of it holds up. But it hasn't been proven start to finish in one single trial. Not yet. That's the honest state of the science, and it's worth saying plainly. What isn't in question, though, is the direction of the underlying shift. The SCN of someone in their 70s is, on average, running on a different schedule than it was at 40. Fighting that shift by forcing a bedtime the body left behind decades ago doesn't restore youth to the clock. It just opens up a nightly gap between the hour the body is actually prepared to power down and the hour a person insists on being awake or asleep. So go back to that 88,000 person dataset for a second. The 10 to 11 p.m. window was never a rule handed down from outside. It was most likely a rough population-level approximation of where an aging SCN, a recalibrated sleep pressure system, a nightly cortisol and blood pressure handoff, and a cardiovascular rhythm built to expect that handoff on schedule, all of it, actually converge for most people once they're past 70. None of this means every 73-year-old should set an alarm for 10 p.m. and force themselves into bed on the dot. The window is a population signal, not a personal prescription, and the more useful takeaway actually sits one layer beneath the specific hour. What this data is really describing is the cost of a chronic, nightly mismatch between an internal clock that has already moved and a schedule that hasn't caught up with it. Someone who's always fallen asleep at 11:30 and wakes up naturally, alert, without an alarm, that person is plausibly sleeping in reasonable alignment with their own SCN, regardless of where that falls relative to the population average. Someone lying awake from 9 p.m. until well past midnight, fighting a schedule that no longer matches their biology, that's who this research is actually describing. Because that gap between attempted sleep onset and actual circadian readiness is exactly where the mistimed handoff happens, night after night, for years. The number on the clock was never really the variable. It was a proxy for something happening inside a cluster of 20,000 neurons just above the optic chiasm, quietly rewriting its own schedule over decades, asking the rest of the body, the vasculature, the adrenal glands, the heart's own rhythm of tension and release to follow along. Most people never learn that negotiation is even happening. They only find out, eventually, whether their schedule agreed to it, or fought it, every single night.